This is not a Pritchett bullet. So before we get into this video, again, I want to highly recommend this book by Brett Gibbons, The English Cartridge. Everything I'm going to convey here today is information that I got by reading this book, and any errors in my video I'll gladly claim for myself as a misremembering or a misunderstanding. But I can't recommend this book enough. If you're interested in the evolution of the British Enfield ammunition, this is a must-have book. I'm not affiliated with this in any way. I don't get paid anything for this, but this book is fantastic. It's really a definitive text that covers the evolution of the 1851 musket and the pattern 1853 musket and the ammunition, most importantly, that goes with it, and all the people that were involved in the evolution of it. So highly recommend this book if you're really interested in knowing more about Enfield ammunition. All right, with that, let's get started. So the Enfield musket, the pattern 1853 Enfield, had three distinct kinds of bullets. And the very first bullet that was tried with the pattern 1853 is the Pritchett bullet. And the Pritchett bullet, smooth-sided, hollow cavity bullet, is what most people think of when they think of Enfield rifle ammunition. They think of a smooth-sided, cylindrical sided bullet, and that's commonly referred to as a Pritchett. But in fact, there were three distinctly different bullets used with the Enfield rifle, and only the first one, used from 1853 to about 1855, was actually a Pritchett bullet. And what makes the Pritchett interesting and different from the other two that followed it is the Pritchett bullet is not an expanding ball. The Pritchett bullet is a compression bullet. It functions by bumping up. So when the charge goes off, even though it does have a bit of a cavity here, this was mostly introduced to shift the center of gravity forward on the bullet. There may have been some expansive effect, but basically this bullet works by compression. So when the charge goes off, it drives the lower half of the bullet into the front half that hasn't started moving yet. Imagine smacking this thing with a sledgehammer. It's going to compress the lead before it starts moving down the barrel. So it is a compression style of bullet, much like the Wilkinson style of bullet. So the Pritchett bullet, again, is a compression bullet, not an expansion bullet. And the problem they had with this bullet was the compression style of bullet couldn't overcome all of the tolerances that could be present based on the sizing dies for this bullet and the manufacturing tolerances of the bore of the musket itself. So the bore of the musket itself could be 0.003 inches or 0.003 of an inch over the 0.577 nominal dimension it was supposed to be. And the Pritchett bullet was supposed to be 0.568 inches in diameter. But the sizing dies were wearing out so quickly at the English arsenals that they started out making the sizing dies 0.566 inches in diameter, which is only 0.002 of an inch smaller than it's supposed to be. But what they did is they started out with the dies at 5.66, and then as the dies wore out, when they got to 5.68, then they were replaced. So it was conceivable to have a bullet that was 0.566 or even 5.65 in diameter, and then the musket barrel be 0.003 inches bigger than it was supposed to be. And that's only 0.005, maybe 0.006 of an inch of windage, but that was enough to defeat the usefulness of this bullet. So if this bullet was manufactured at its smallest size, and you happen to shoot it out of a musket that's bore was at its largest size, this bullet was not able to overcome that level of windage in the barrel. And they discovered that around 1855, and it was an absolute disaster when it came about. It was a big crisis, and people were concerned that it was going to result in the demise of the Enfield rifle itself. Fortunately, Colonel Hay at the School of Musketry at Hythe already knew the solution, because the pattern 1851 musket had already utilized a different kind of bullet that was an actual expanding ball bullet. So Hay recommended going back to a bullet or copying the design of the pattern 51. And so the pattern 1851 bullet was a smooth-sided bullet, and it utilized a deep cavity, but it was what I would call a forced expansion bullet. To start off with, it had a hemispherical iron cup that was placed in the bottom of the bullet, and the charge would drive this into the bore, into this cavity. That would force this to expand to take up the rifling. Now, this bullet was still 0.568 inches in diameter, and there was some concern with this iron cup. The problem is it wouldn't always be seated, perfectly straight in the bore. It could be crooked like this, and so it didn't consistently get driven into the bullet as it ought to. Sometimes this would actually fall out of the bullet. There was concern that it would pepper troops that you were firing over their heads. And sometimes there was even cases where this would somehow get left behind in the barrel. So the iron cup, while that was used in the pattern 1851, and it was initially used in the Hay bullet, it was quickly replaced with another iron cup that was conical shaped. And by being conical shaped like this, a truncated cone, it wanted to self-center and self-align in this bore in the bullet. So this was a much better design, and so immediately they had ordered 1 million or so of these hemispherical iron cups and more of these iron cones, and they were quickly superseded. They did tests, and they discovered that a wooden plug was superior to all of them. And so this hollow iron cup was superseded by a wooden plug. And so all of these are still a forced expansion bullet. And so smooth-sided, you've got basically a wedge that is driven into the bullet when the charge goes off that forces that bullet to expand. So this is the second generation of bullet, different from the Pritchett. The Pritchett is a compression style of bullet to take up the windage, whereas the Hay bullet is a true expanding ball bullet that works by forced expansion with a plug or a wedge. Both were 5.68 in diameter. Well, it didn't take long, and it was discovered when this cartridge was initially made, the paper, these bullets were all paper patched bullets, and the paper of the cartridge was wrapped around the end and just kind of folded and tucked into this cavity in the Pritchett bullet. And that worked okay most of the time. But with the advent of this plug, now there's no cavity for the paper to be folding into this, to fold into. And so as a result, they started to discover, and it was a problem even with the Pritchett bullet, that when these were loaded into the muzzle, it sometimes would unfold the paper and strip off the paper. It was such a tight fit between the bullet and the cartridge paper and the bore of the muzzle, especially after firing, and especially after these bullets had been exposed to the elements during transportation, that sometimes that paper would get stripped off. And so you would ram the bullet home with your ramrod, it would strip off the paper, you'd pull the ramrod out of the bore, and the paper patch would actually be caught on the broad end of the ramrod. And of course, then your accuracy is totally gone, because these bullets were designed to have paper between them and the bore to take up the windage. So that was bad news. So they quickly changed the design of the cartridge around 1857 to be tied. So the cartridge is tied, and I've got other videos that demonstrate, how those cartridges are made. But the end of the cartridge would be choked and tied instead of just folded over the base of the bullet. Well, that worked for a while, and then it was discovered, partly by experiments for different kinds of bullet lubricant, that this bullet was just too large for the bore. And they had already known this, again, with experiments and experience with the pattern 1851 musket, that it really didn't need to be such a tight fit in the bore. And it wasn't advantageous, especially under service conditions. The bullet became hard to load. And so around, I think it's 1857, if I'm remembering my date right, Captain Boxer, 1858, Captain Boxer proposed going to a bullet that was radically undersized from the Hay bullet. So the Boxer bullet, the Hay bullet was 0.568 inches nominally in diameter. Boxer proposed a radical undersizing of the bullet. It was 0.550 inches in diameter. So, 18 thousandths of an inch smaller than the Hay bullet. And there was a lot of concern about this when it was originally proposed. There were people that thought that the bullet would slide out of the muzzle under use. And it turns out they did testing. They had soldiers run around and shake the barrels, and it just wasn't a problem. So the Boxer bullet, was also intended to use a plug, just like, the Hay bullet did. And so this represents the third and final variant of bullet for the Enfield musket. So to start off with, these plugs, just like with the Hay bullet, they were made of wood. They were made of boxwood. But the boxwood was expensive. It was difficult to obtain a consistent supply. And so by 1860 or so, they changed this over to a clay-fired plug. And that was the final evolution of the cartridge and plug combination. So that represents the three distinctly different kinds of bullets that were used with the pattern 1853 rifle musket. Only one of these is actually a Pritchett bullet, the compression bullet. And so these are all distinctly different types of bullet, with the Pritchett bullet being a compression bullet, the Hay being a forced expansion bullet of 0.568 inches in diameter, and the Boxer bullet being also a forced expansion bullet, but 0.550 inches in diameter. So all completely different, and I think it's important as amateur historians that we address these bullets by their truly proper names, because they are such distinctly different bullets. And certainly these two batches of them, the Pritchett functions on an entirely different principle than the other two. So there you have it. Hope that clears up some of the mystery behind the quote-unquote Pritchett bullet and Enfield ammunition in general. Again, I highly recommend, if you want to know more and the in-depth details behind all of this evolution, that you check out this book by Brett Gibbons. It really is fantastic, and it covers all this and more.